Good afternoon, everybody. Let me tell you how pleased I am that you all came today, which is different than most of your classmates. It looks a lot emptier today than it did on Tuesday. Can't imagine why. Let me just remind you that Tuesday is Veterans Day, and it's a university holiday, so we will not have a lecture. So I hope you're applauding for our veterans and not the announcement, since I have nothing to do with the university's decision, but we should all give thanks to our veterans for their services. Okay, so today we begin the final third, roughly, of our course, or at least the third module. So everything that we're going to do between now and the end of the semester is still going to be working with our aggregate supply and demand model. So please don't forget the things that you've already learned. What we're going to do, though, is to add some bells and whistles to it to try to make it a bit more realistic. Thank you for coming, at least for a few minutes. We're going to add some bells and whistles to it to make it a bit more realistic. So today and next Thursday, we're going to talk a little bit more about monetary policy. Then we're going to spend 2 days talking about exchange rates and international economics. Then we'll talk about fiscal policy. And then we'll take an examination of expectations that are different than adaptive expectations and see what effect that might have in terms of the way our model works. Right? So basically, again, aggregate supply and demand doing a few new things. Today and next Thursday, we want to talk about macroeconomic policy. So the key with macroeconomic policy is to figure out what it is we're trying to achieve. Right? What is it that we want macroeconomic policy to achieve? So in general, what we find is that macroeconomic policy is concerned with two big issues: economic output and how close or far are we away from potential output, and inflation. Is it high, low, somewhere in between? Is it too high or too low? So in general, what we would like to see macroeconomic policy achieve is to stabilize economic output close to potential and to stabilize inflation at a relatively low level, with the idea that both of those things give us some real benefits. Now, when we use macroeconomic policy in this way, we're really talking about something that comes under the heading of stabilization policy. And stabilization policy, at least from a macroeconomic perspective, is generally pursued through either monetary policy or fiscal policy. Right? So monetary policy, changing our R-bar term, changing our real interest rate in a way to try to affect the aggregate demand curve and potential output in inflation. Fiscal policy, changing government purchases, transfer payments, and taxes, also has a similar goal. That is to try to affect the aggregate demand curve to keep us close to potential output with a low and stable inflation rate. Now, it turns out that for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about in more detail over the next couple of weeks, the primary responsibility for stabilization policy is taken by monetary policy, not fiscal policy. So monetary policy, then, you remember in a long-term sense, what the quantity theory of money told us, was that monetary policy was basically responsible for inflation in the long run. And the way that policy has evolved over the last several decades, monetary policy is also responsible for stabilization policy in the short run. Right? So we're going to look closer at monetary policy today and next Thursday. Then I say we're going to interject exchange rates, and then we'll come back to fiscal policy as well. So when we think about the goal of stabilizing economic output around potential, we're essentially saying the same thing as trying to stabilize the unemployment rate around the natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment rate that exists when the economy is at potential output. So what Oken's law tells us is that stabilizing one near output, near potential, is similar to stabilizing the unemployment rate near the natural rate of unemployment. This is sometimes referred to as trying to achieve maximum sustainable employment. Now, we call this maximum sustainable employment rather than maximum employment because we don't really mean maximum employment. We want to have that level of employment that also helps to stabilize the inflation rate. If the employment level is too high, there's too much demand in the economy, inflation will begin to accelerate. And something's going to happen because of that. And if employment is too low, then there will be a negative output gap, inflation will fall, and again, we would like to see some sort of policy reaction for that. So we always want to think then about maximum sustainable employment as being at the natural rate of unemployment. And that natural rate of unemployment will not be zero. There are reasons that unemployment will exist even when the labor markets are in long-run equilibrium. It will exist because of two types of unemployment that typically exist in the economy all the time. The first is what we call frictional unemployment, or sometimes referred to as turnover unemployment. This is basically the unemployment that exists as people move either from one job to another with some spell of unemployment in between, or move from being out of the labor force, being in school, having left the labor force for whatever reason, and then returning. Because, as we've mentioned before, there is not full and complete information about all the available job openings to individual job seekers, it may take some time in order to find an appropriate job. This is going to exist no matter what the state of the economy is going to be. So that's frictional unemployment. It is generally fairly short-term unemployment. That is, we're typically talking about this being a matter of weeks, not multiple months. A more serious type of unemployment is what we call structural unemployment. Structural unemployment exists when the skill set of the job seekers, the unemployed workers, and the job openings, the employers looking for new hires, don't match. Right? We might be looking for computer programmers, but the people who are unemployed are carpenters. Right? A different skill set. This is why structural unemployment is sometimes referred to as mismatch unemployment. We have a mismatch between the skills of the unemployed and the demands for skills for the job openings. Typically, when we have structural unemployment, it is much longer term, measured in months, if not quarters, or sometimes even longer. So the structurally unemployed require a different approach to trying to bring structural unemployment down than, say, with the frictional unemployed. Frictionally unemployed, you want to create more information, right? This is what internet job sites are all about. How do we get people to understand what job openings are there? How do we find employers to look at a wide variety of job seekers who have all sorts of skills? Structurally unemployed workers, however, need to do one of two things. They either need to retrain to acquire the kinds of skills that are necessary for the job openings, or they need to move to a location where their job skills are being sought. Okay? That's a much, much more difficult public policy issue. Okay? Now, unemployment is something that we worry about. We worry about it a lot, both for individual reasons as well as social reasons. From the individual perspective, when we have unemployment, the individuals who are unemployed either have lost a job or can't find a job. As a result, they typically don't have income, or at least they don't have very much income. This causes, obviously, financial stress for those unemployed individuals and their families. That stress may also turn into more than just financial stress, but may also be marital stress and all sorts of psychological stress for the unemployed workers. So we worry about that on an individual basis. But the other thing that it tells us, when we have a lot of unemployed workers, there's a lot of resources in the economy that are not being used. Right? When workers are unemployed, it's also likely that capital, physical capital, is also not being employed. Right? Office buildings are only partly vacant. Desks and computers are not being used to their fullest extent. The economy would be capable of producing much more. It's just not making use of all its productive resources. Right? So we lose out on both the national level as well as the individual level. Now, keep in mind at that national level, when we have a lot of unemployment, economic output will be lower, but economic output is also income. So incomes will be lower, not just for individual workers who are unemployed, but also for businesses. So corporate profits will be lower. When incomes fall, typically tax payments fall. So the tax receipts of the government will be lower, and now you've got budget deficits that need to be dealt with. So lower output, lower income across the board for individuals, for businesses, and for government. In addition, lower income also means lower spending. Right? So total amount of spending is also falling in the overall economy. So those are the reasons we pay a lot of attention to unemployment and the unemployment rate. Okay. Now, we can talk about trying to stabilize output around potential or the unemployment rate around the natural rate of unemployment. There are only a few problems with actually doing so. Neither the potential output level nor the natural rate of unemployment is directly observable. It's not something out there that we can just go and simply measure. It needs to be calculated based on a whole variety of underlying assumptions. Because it's not directly observable and we have to basically construct it, there's a lot of ambiguity as to what the precise measurement is. And if we can't measure it precisely and we're using some unusual assumptions, there may be disagreements about what those assumptions are, or how they should be interpreted, or how they should be included in our calculations, which means there's more uncertainty associated with our measurement of the natural rate. So as an example, we typically, because of this uncertainty, we typically think of the natural rate as in a range rather than a specific number. And today, you can find people who will talk about a natural rate as low as 5%. But you'll also find people who are talking about a natural rate as high as 6.5%. Well, the actual unemployment rate today is 5.9. So at 5.9, we're either about a full percentage point above the natural rate, or maybe we're a half a percentage point below the natural rate. It makes a difference. Do we have a positive output gap or a negative output gap? Right? That's the difference that it makes. So how do we know that? Right? So if you're trying to create a policy, but you don't actually know whether you have a positive or a negative output gap, it's really hard to figure out exactly what policy you should be following. So without having a much more precise measure, it becomes much more difficult to formulate policy. The other thing that makes it difficult to formulate policy is not only can we not measure the natural rate of unemployment precisely, it can change over time for a whole variety of reasons, some of which we can account for, changes in demographics as an example, and some of which we can't account for. At least we can't account for in a very precise way. So we have to just keep in mind that, yes, we want to stabilize the economy around potential, or the unemployment rate around the natural rate, but we don't have those precise measurements. So we can't be pounding the table that we actually have to do something when the economy appears to be somewhat close to potential output. Now, we also have a goal of trying to stabilize inflation at a relatively low level. And the reason for that is twofold. First, when inflation is high, 20%, 50%, or 100%, the month-to-month variability or volatility inflation goes up exponentially. So you get much, much more variability in the monthly inflation rates when the average inflation rate is high as compared to when it's low. More volatility, of course, makes us less certain about what the underlying inflation rate is. So there'd be more uncertainty about inflation. Most people don't like uncertainty. Right? Most individuals are risk averse. We would prefer to have a certain environment to operate in than a highly uncertain environment. This is particularly true for businesses who might undertake long-term investments. So if you don't know what the inflation environment is, you also don't know what the nominal interest rate environment is. Remember the Fisher effect. So if you don't know what the nominal inflation environment looks like, now you don't know what your cost of borrowing is. So how can you figure out what your rate of return is going to be in your profit margin? So to the extent that business executives have a tendency to be risk averse in their investments, high inflation, which brings about high volatility of inflation, would reduce investment activity, and less investment, a smaller capital stock. The capital stock is growing more slowly. Long-run economic activity will be slower. Now, I hope you just recognize that what I just said is a violation of the classical dichotomy. High and volatile inflation reduces investment and leads to slower long-term economic growth. But high inflation is a nominal variable. Slower economic growth would be a real variable. The classical dichotomy says that shouldn't happen. But the data says it does. And it's primarily because of this variability in inflation that creates more uncertainty. So what we see then is that central banks generally think about price stability as their primary goal. Their primary goal. Now, we saw earlier with a quantity theory of money that a central bank has the ultimate responsibility for the rate of inflation in the long run. What we're saying here is that the central bank also has the primary responsibility for the rate of inflation in the short run. Now, when we talk about price stability, we do not mean that the price level is not changing. We actually mean a very low and hopefully quite steady inflation rate. So prices will be rising. It's really inflation stability that we're looking at a low level. And if inflation is at a very low level, then prices won't be rising very quickly, and very few decisions will be made about the changes in prices. Okay? So most central banks have adopted price stability, if not as their only goal, at least one of their primary goals. And the way that this is typically enacted is through the adoption of something known as an inflation target, right? Pi super T, inflation target. So a central bank might say something like, we have a target inflation rate of, let me pick a number, 2%. Now, they're not looking to hit 2% each and every month, and they're not even looking to hit 2% on average over a year. But they would be looking to hit 2% on average over a 2 to 3 or 4 year time frame. Right? So they're going to let there be short-run deviations between actual inflation and their target, but they don't want to trend away from that target level. Now, most central banks around the world have either explicitly or implicitly an inflation target. The banks that have explicit inflation targets, there's about 2 or 3 dozen of them now around the country, generally have a target range of somewhere between 1% and 3%, with the vast majority of those between 1.5% and 2.5%. So as an example, the European Central Bank has an inflation target that says below but close to 2%. Below but close to 2%. Right? So in essence, they have a 1.9% inflation target. It's explicit. The Federal Reserve, on the other hand, does not have an explicit inflation target, at least not explicit in the sense that it's part of their official legislative mandate. But rather, the Federal Reserve has said, we would like to see inflation, a particular measure that they want to look at 2% per year. So again, it's another 2%. Again, most of them give a range just because inflation is going to be volatile for a variety of reasons. Now, if we want to keep inflation low and stable, one way to do it is to minimize what we call the inflation gap, the difference between actual inflation and our target rate. Now, we have to be careful with target rates of inflation. We don't want them to be too low. So when inflation targets are too low, and the economy then experiences a negative aggregate demand shock, so remember what that means. We have a negative aggregate demand shock. AD curve shifts to the left. Along an upward rising short-run aggregate supply curve, economic output would fall, so would inflation. So suppose that you have a target inflation rate of 1%, and you get a big negative aggregate demand shock, something of the order of magnitude that we saw in 2008 or 9. That might easily take 2 or 3 percentage points off inflation. Now you've fallen into a deflationary environment. Prices are actually falling on balance. Now, we all like to shop, right, when there's a sale on, because prices are lower. But in a deflationary environment, the problem is prices are dropping continuously, and so are wages. The difficulty becomes twofold. One is, suppose you're graduating in May, and what you really, really, really want as a graduation present is a brand new car. With a big engine, bright red, convertible, all those wonderful things. But your parents, who want to give you a really, really nice graduation present, says, yes, I could buy you a brand new car in May. But we're in a deflation environment. So in December, the car's going to be cheaper than it'll be in May. So let's wait till December and buy it then. It'll be a really nice Christmas present. And you go, okay, I'd really like that new car now when I graduate, but I guess I can wait for Christmas. And then all of a sudden December comes up, and you go and you talk to your parents, and you say, remember that car you were going to get me? And your dad, because it's almost invariably the dad, I know from where I speak, will say, but think about this. It's now December, but in June of next year, the car's going to be cheaper again. So let's wait another 6 months. Well, notice that if you think prices are falling, one of the things you want to do for big expensive items like cars or houses, or if you're a business, capital equipment, is you want to postpone your purchase. But guess what happens if you postpone your purchase? The aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. Economic output goes down. Inflation goes down further. Now prices start to fall more quickly. And you can get yourself into a downward deflationary spiral. There's one other real problem with deflation, too. And this was pointed out by Irving Fisher. Fisher equation, Fisher effect, same Irving Fisher. He shouldn't have been quite so busy, otherwise we wouldn't have to talk about him so much. Anyway, Irving Fisher pointed out, if your nominal wages are falling, we've got a problem. If you have any debt, the nominal interest rate will not go below 0. So you've got a positive nominal interest rate with declining wages. That means your debt payments are not falling as your income is. So if you're going to maintain your debt payments, because you really like that new car, then you have to use a larger share of your falling income to make your debt service payments, which leaves you less money to spend on other goods and services, which shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left. Output falls further, inflation falls more. This is what Irving Fisher referred to as a debt deflation. You get the deflation because people are trying to service their debts, and they have less and less money to spend on other goods and services. The other big issue with setting a inflation target that's too low in the face of a negative aggregate demand shock, remember, central banks now have the primary responsibility for stabilization policy. How do they exercise that policy? They want to reduce the nominal interest rate in order to bring down the real interest rate. But the nominal interest rate can only fall to 0. So what we call the zero lower bound. And we'll talk much more about it next Thursday. Once the nominal interest rate that the central bank controls is down to 0, the game's up. They don't have any more flexibility for pushing that rate even lower. So that sort of traditional or conventional monetary policy now all of a sudden has to stop. So one doesn't want to have too low an inflation target in case there is a